All right, so in terms of human organization, like I said, there's a lot of information on these slides. Um, I don't know that I need to read them all. I'm going to point out the main points here that separates the differences. So yeah, uh, band, oldest version of human cultural organization. We're talking about Homo erectus, Homo habilis, really all the way up until 10,000 years ago when the ice melted and we started to get into horticulture. Um, so these are hunter-gatherer foragers, and they are going to be organized in what is called bands. They're about 20 to 300 people, egalitarian, not hierarchical. Uh, uh, Individuals step up for certain jobs based on talent and work ethic. This was encouraged by positive reinforcement or humiliation, right? So if there was a person in the band that was not pulling their weight, then they would probably be made fun of until they started to work harder. Decisions are made collectively. This is through self-government. The kente cloth in Ghana is a sacred fabric, color shapes associated with proverbs, leaders, events, and plants. This is one of those vocabulary terms that comes up in Barbara Miller's book. Laws are governed by cultural norms and taboos. They're not written. They're basically passed down through stories. An extreme example that I like to give is the idea of a taboo in keeping children safe. One might be that there might be a lake further out that the adults go and fish at, but in order to keep the kids away from the lake because they maybe don't know how to swim yet, that it's called Death Lake or something like that, and that's the taboo that there's a monster occupying it. We come up with all kinds of stories to help keep kids safe, and this would be one of those ways. Not many surviving band levels left. Kind of my question here is why not? The why not is hopefully you could pause it right here and answer that question if you wanted to. The why not tends to be that in state level societies, the goal is to take more, get more, and have more people in control or being controlled by them so that they have more workers and or people in that society. So band level groups have gone the way of colonies and imperialism, really. All right, tribes develop around this horticulture time period, the changing in weather. We start to get, this is around 10,000, 12,000 years ago. And again, we're starting to shift in terms of how we get our food to horticulture and pastoralism. It's a combination of several different bands. A lot of them are related, and this could be 300 people all the way up to 5,000. Now, mostly egalitarian, but led by a headman or head woman who is a temporary leader who earns leadership through personal achievements, aka prestige in society. They might be in charge of timing for moving and or planting. They're usually connected through kinship and clan structure in terms of the social organization. And like I was said earlier, that when the issues subside, that headman or headwoman will basically pass the power back to the group. We have big men and big women, formal political organization between tribe and chiefdom, involving reliance on a leadership of key individuals who develop a political following through personal ties and redistribution. Redistribution has a lot to do with like things like potlatch. And so let's say that we have a big woman or a big man in charge. They are going to be in charge pretty much for their lifetime. And the way that they maintain that power is to have big ceremonies and festivals to keep their prestige and their status up in the society. So this is really where we start to see a shift politically in leadership. Big men tend to have more wealth than others. So this is really moving into a social hierarchical system where wealth becomes the status issue. Responsible for internal affairs, timing of crops, feasts, trade, and war. MOCA is the strategy for developing political leadership in New Guinea that involves gift exchange and favors with individuals and sponsoring large feasts. So we can see this all over the world, this transition between the tribe and kind of chiefdoms. Remember, this is not a scribe status. This is achieved still, just like headmen. So when we get into chiefdoms, they're going to be different because this is an ascribed status. It's composed of a number of villages or communities or a number of tribes that combine into chiefdoms. Chiefdoms can get very large, up into the tens of thousands of people. And then the power is usually inherited from the father to son. Religious rituals and beliefs, this is also where we're going to get a shift. often serve to confirm the chief's authority. So we start to get into a religious class and or kind of priestdom class where the priests are also bestowing kind of a divine right to the chief. And this is a huge transformation in terms of how one individual will have power over all of these other people. Chiefs tend to be the enforcer of laws, and colonialism really messed with this when they, and I think I've talked about this too a lot in this class, right? When the missionaries and other Western people showed up and met with native groups, they would ask, "Where is your chief?" And just asking in that in terms of language, that has power. And then if the group sent up a female, they might say, "No, no, no, we want to talk to the male leader." And then they send up a male and they said, "Oh, here's your chief." Just in that group is bestowing a status symbol on that individual so that their indigenous group is now seeing that individual as the chief because they're being recognized by another group as the chief. It's a very simple process. And we might think, oh, well, why didn't they fight against that? Or because that's how relationships work. And if you start to realize that these powerful people with guns and this different culture are recognizing this other structure that doesn't really exist, you can make that exist and work out in your own mind. And that's what societies did a lot in the New World. The state began in Mesopotamia and Egypt 5,000 years ago. Most states come into being after World War II. Currently, there's more than 196 now. This is an old number. No one person is the law, but the state is responsible for the law and law enforcement. Again, I put up here the pharaoh. I tend to divide the state into ancient states and modern states. The reason being, obviously, that since kind of America came into being, which is kind of a benefit and an amazing thing. Remember, America does give us back some of these egalitarian rights, like direct democracy. Democracy itself is definitely more of an egalitarian thing. But so the ancient state tended to be more of like a gigantic chiefdom where the pharaoh could have even been related to the religious divine, right? The pharaoh for sure is almost seen as a living god in most of the kind of Egyptian history. But then also like the enforcer of laws, when to go to war, that kind of stuff acts more like a chiefdom, but it's very large and it's state level. Huge division of labor in terms of what men and women do. However, Mayat is the law structure in Egypt. So the law does become kind of an important component that then the state becomes an enforcer of. There is in the state constant change through individuals and groups and social movements. So this is again one of those like what I would call the pyramid of culture or pyramid of civilization. This is what it looks like in terms of status structure, where you have farmers at the very, very bottom, even though they're supplying all the food to everybody on top. The state also, this gets more into the modern state. Specialization of the state, it encompasses all aspects of culture and stands above all elements of society. Mail delivery, taxes, jury duty, passports, distribution of food, the poor, vertically encompassed. This is a fascinating piece too. When we talk about the collapse of the Mayan civilization, remember the Mayan people didn't just all die. They basically walked out on their civilization. And the reason is that they were going through a lot of famine. And if you're watching relatives die, you're no longer going to trust the state to provide those basic needs for you. And that's how fragile the state is. If food distribution breaks down at the civilization or state level, people revert back to either bands or tribal levels, to be honest, because that's what works best, right? The state is much more fragile. So Max Weber states have a monopoly on legitimate use of force, right? So they're the only ones that should be able to use force on people. Hegemony is a term it means the ability to dominate a group to create consent and agreement within a population without the threat of force. So hegemony, a lot of times we get into issues of propaganda and some of these other things where maybe your voice is being used or the way that you phrase things, language is being used in order to create kind of this consent and agreement. And really it's a power over, it's a version of power over and manipulation and some of those other things. Nationalism is the tool to create a perception of shared unity. This goes back to imagined communities, right? Which is if we say the Pledge of Allegiance every day when we're kids, if we sing the Star Spangled Banner every time before a football or baseball game, if we see the American flag, eagles, those symbols, all of those things work to form nationalism and nationalistic patriotism, right? Neoliberalism is the breaking down of some state power through globalization. So this is a fascinating one. This is almost deregulation and privatization, corporatization, so that the state gets out of the way and corporate and private entities tend to have more power. And this is one of those interesting things that really, really started taking off in the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher in Britain. NGOs also create an avenue of activism against state injustices. So these are non-governmental agencies all over the world that tend to try to help people and fix the issues of neoliberalism. So some fascinating kind of state level stuff there. Again, nationalism, imagined communities, territorialization or religious faiths. A lot of times religious groups are in charge of certain swaths of land. Decline of the antique kinship. So kinship structures are starting to decline all over the world in terms of how people are related to one another, because this rugged American individualism is really sweeping the world, which basically degrades kinship. You don't need to connect as much to your bloodline when that happens. The interaction between capitalism and print. Benedict Anderson, who wrote the Imagined Communities book, basically talks that once print came in and we had newspapers kind of all saying the same thing, we really start to get this new version of nationalism, which is we're all speaking the same vernacular, speaking about issues in the same way, that then things can be phrased in a nationalistic way. Secular languages of the state. This is moving kind of outside of religious conversation and more into political. Changing concepts of time and space. This also gets into space, of course, when we talk about our own small little worlds, we get into a macro culture space-wise when we get into nationalism as well. So this is one of those cartoons that I included. This is what early colonialism looked like, especially and this is an example of what happened in kind of the Australia area. How about a compromise? We keep the land and mineral rights, natural resources, fishing and timber, and we acknowledge you as the traditional owners of it. This is about how colonialism worked. So the anthropology of law, E.A. Hobel really defines kind of a social norm. This is his definition of law, right? By application of physical force by an individual or group possessing a socially recognized privilege of so acting. We let police because we have acknowledged that this is their role. One of the other things we get into is the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what that is basically in the 40s, the United States had a big part in writing what we saw as human rights. Now, the issue is that they're coming from a biased Western perspective. So it's discounting a lot of cultural norms in other places. So what we get into this right and wrong issue is that we ignore cultural relativity when we write what is right for humans, right? And it may be that scarification of boys to become men we see as torture or not right. But somehow we think that circumcision of baby boys is totally normal. This is a Western bias, and it was put into these human rights. So this is where we get into the kind of the issues of right and wrong. Social order and conflict theory is when we get into this. Militarism, social control, a norm is agreed upon standard for how to live. Law is a binding rule written down. Social control in smaller cultures, again, I talked about this conflict resolution. You either talked it out, one-on-one fights did happen, shaming, ridicule, and ostracization. State level, you have trials, courts, policing, trial through ordeal, physical or mental torture to find guilt or innocence. This last one gets into kind of the witch hunt stuff, where they would like drown or attempt to drown people, but if they lived, then they were innocent and those kinds of things. Social inequality, the law and conflicts, critical legal anthropology. You guys can read some of this. Social justice, ethnic conflict, ethnocide, destruction of a particular culture. Sectarian conflict gets into religious groups or sects, usually in conflict. War, global, corporate social responsibility. These are people trying to keep corporate entities kind of responsible and doing the right thing. Anthropology power, I talked about it already. Power to do, power over. I'm trying to kind of finish in two sections of lecture this week. So I think I did it. Have a great week.